Hang on. Hello. Today we're reviewing this dog. Good boy. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the PNY 3GB GTX 1060. When the 3GB 1060 first launched, some suggested that it shouldn't have even been called a 1060, because not only did it feature half the VRam, but it also had 10% less CUDA cores than its bigger 6GB brother. Now I actually quite liked the 3GB 1060 and I had one in my system for quite some time, the Zotac Mini Edition. I thought that for 1080p gaming it did a pretty respectable job, and considering I was on a tighter budget and I could have the 3GB version for £50 less, I thought why not go for it, and I was pretty pleased with my decision. Today though, I want to ask the question, is one of these still worth buying? And what can it do in 2019? Well, let's give this thing centre stage today, talk about how it handles some AAA titles, and then discuss what other options you may want to consider if you're shopping around at this sort of price point. Without further ado then, let's get into it and see how the 3GB 1060 handles itself in July, August 2019. So this 3GB PNY card features 1152 CUDA cores, a clock speed of 1506 MHz and requires one 6-pin connector. It's very quiet considering it has just one fan and exhibits no whine under load. I paid just over £110 used, and that's not really a particularly unusual price. The 3GB 1060 just isn't as popular as the 6GB version, as you'd expect for the obvious reasons. The cheapest 3GB card was £40 less than the cheapest 6GB card on eBay UK. If that price difference doesn't deter you, then stop watching and just get the 6GB 1060. You could probably expect to pay even less in an auction. But first, let's see what it can do on its own. We won't be focusing on comparisons just yet. 1080p is the best suited resolution for this hardware, and so that's what I've stuck with throughout. Let's kick things off with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, probably the most demanding game out of today's tested ones. I'm using an i5-8400 along with 16GB of 3200 MHz memory. For Assassin's Creed Odyssey I left things at the high preset, the settings that were pre-applied by the game, and left everything else as it was. I made no adjustments to the resolution scale, anti-aliasing or VSync settings as I fired up the benchmark test and ran it a total of 5 times, combining the scores and taking an average from said results. Keep your eyes on the VRam usage in the top left as well as we make our way through all of today's tests. The GPU usage pretty much hit 99% throughout all of today's gameplay results, meaning the card is exhibiting its full potential. In Odyssey we saw an average of 56 frames per second. The 1% low figure of 19 meant some stutter did occur. As we move on to Battlefield 5, I opted for the high settings yet again, but I was using DirectX 11 mode as I seem to see a couple more frames by doing so. This is graphics card dependent though, and results may vary across different hardware. With the high preset at 1080p with 100% resolution scaling, we saw an average frame rate of over 70 FPS. A very nice result here as we made our way up this hill. As this is real world gameplay, things may change depending on the level you're playing, but hitting at least 60 shouldn't be a problem for the 3GB 1060 throughout. The 1% and 0.1% lows were also pretty solid, and there were no noticeable frame drops even as the action started to heat up. I found that Battlefield 5 does tend to be pretty well optimised for a wide range of hardware. Dirt Rally 2 also gave us solid performance with this card, averaging 60 FPS overall during this time trial run. Just like in Battlefield 5, we saw some very nice 1% and 0.1% lows to go along with the average, and you shouldn't have any problems here. I don't know about you, but I find the cars to be quite hard to control in this one, but nonetheless it's still a fun one to play. Performance may differ from track to track, but I don't think there'll be any major differences. The 3GB 1060 seems to be doing okay, but again, keep your eye on that VRam usage in the top left as we continue to move through the benchmarks. Despite the pretty decent average in Far Cry New Dawn, the 0.1% time did suffer. We were hitting over 60 FPS during the benchmark run, but there were a couple of micro stutters. Nothing significant, but it's still worth noting. The game looks and runs great most of the time, and I ran around the open world a little bit afterwards just to see how things compared. There it seems like there were less stutters because the action-packed moments were fewer and further between, unlike the benchmark run that packs a lot into one place. Rage 2 still allowed us to run about all guns blazing without much in the way of slowdown. Again, it was the high preset here, and I have to say that although we weren't hitting 60 FPS, the game played pretty well in terms of consistency. There was no real stutter to speak of, but I definitely advise medium to try and hit a better average if I'm honest. Overall though, well, I was quite surprised it did this well, as I've had mixed experiences with Rage. Sometimes it does well on hardware you don't expect it to, and vice versa. But it's a pretty fun game and definitely worth a try. So just look up some benchmarks of your card before buying. Also, it doesn't work on dual-core CPUs, from my experience anyway. Finally, in Fortnite, which has seen a season update, we were able to run the game at Epic to see a plus 60 FPS average. In fact, we were averaging 90 overall. It's a solid result, but dropping things to high might make those percentile figures a little better. But what about in comparison to the 6GB card? How does the beefier version compare results-wise to everything we see on screen here? Well, I've thrown some comparative figures up on screen for you. For the results, I used a Palette Jetstream card. Here's how things differed. As you can see, the results weren't too different as far as averages were concerned, but the extra VRAM might help eliminate a few of those stutters in some cases, and I guess the results totally vary from game to game. So, that is the 3GB GTX 1060, a card that can still handle itself fairly well at 1080p, and in some instances provide you with a smooth 60 frames per second gaming experience, especially if you're willing to turn those settings down a little bit. In some cases though, you might find yourself wishing for an extra gig of VRAM, and that's where something like AMD's RX 570 may come in handy. It doesn't cost that much more new. In fact, I think you can probably find a few RX 570s here in the UK at least for around £110–120, which is about the same price I paid for this 1060, so that's something to bear in mind as well. There's also a lot of 6GB 1060s on places like eBay for not that much more money, and I think if you have the budget to stretch to it, then that would be a no-brainer even in 2019. Of course, it's also worth remembering the processing power regardless of the VRAM. The 1060 is a few years old now, and as we move forward in this world of very demanding games, you may start to see it struggle regardless of the amount of memory it actually has. For now, it still seems to be a pretty decent budget mainstream solution to anyone working with a slightly tighter budget. They still seem to be pretty plentiful on the used market as well. So would I recommend a 3GB 1060 in 2019? Well, it's a tough one really, because it totally depends on the price that you pay for it. I think for a 1080p gaming card with very little outlay in terms of money, then it does a pretty decent job, but you may find yourself wishing you purchased that 6GB card if you start to see a few stutters here and there. I do think though that some of the hate toward the card is unwarranted, considering it can still hold its own to some degree, but it may not be the wisest purchase decision right now, put it that way. With all that said and done, I hope you enjoyed the look back at the 3GB 1060 in 2019. I'm going to leave it a little bit open-ended here. Let me know if you think it's worth purchasing down below in the comments. Let me know if you've got a 1060 3GB in your system and how well it's holding up. Let me know if there are any games out there that do struggle with the card, and leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Excuse the seagulls squawking outside, someone's dropped a sausage in the road. I think. I'll see you all in the next one. Hey guys, so I just want to apologise for the lack of uploads this week. I haven't been feeling great. Quite a loud chewer, aren't you? You've left a bit, look. You've left a bit, look. Good boy. Yeah, so anyway, I think I was in the sun too long. We've had record temperatures over the last couple of weeks in the UK, but I think it's been about 40 here. You're probably laughing at me. But yeah, I haven't been feeling great, but hopefully I can get back into the swing of things and get the schedule back to normal. So, with all that said, thank you as always for watching. Say thank you, Harry. And hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one. High five. High five. High five. Disappeared.